Jesus is better. Today on another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Today we're going through Hebrews chapter 7 through 10. Tomorrow we're going to go through Hebrews chapter 11 through 13. So let's dive in and let's see what we get here, because Jesus is clearly better. This is probably one of the biggest sections of comparisons that there are. These chapters are extended discourse, so to speak, on the superiority of the priesthood of Christ as demonstrated by the superiority of his order, his covenant, his ministry, and his sacrifice. So we get to chapter 7 verses 1 through 19 here, and the Levitical priesthood of the Jews was grounded in the order of Aaron, right? But the priesthood of Jesus Christ is grounded in the order of Melchizedek. The mysterious Melchizedek appeared in Genesis chapter 14, verse 18 through 20, and he was not mentioned again until the messianic promise was made in Psalm 110. Now, the author of Hebrews drew from the Old Testament witness to show the order of Melchizedek was eternal in origin and in scope. Now, Melchizedek was a type of Christ reflecting the divine attributes of eternity, righteousness, peace, and sovereignty. Now, his eternality, I guess you would say, is evident in that he was a priest forever. I may have just made up a new word, eternality. Without record of beginning or end, right? So he is priest forever. No beginning, no end, forever. From infinity behind us to infinity in front of us. Now, his righteousness is evident in his name, since Melchizedek is actually Hebrew for King of Righteousness. His peace is evident in the fact that he was also declared to be the King of Salem, which means King of Peace. Now, finally, Melchizedek's sovereignty was recognized by Abraham, who paid this priest king a tithe of all he had when he returned victorious from war. Now, the Levitical priesthood was inferior to that of Melchizedek because the inferior is blessed by the superior. The sovereignty of Melchizedek is reflected in the sovereignty of the Son of God, because while the Levitical priesthood was authorized by a legal regulation, the priesthood of Christ was authorized by the power of an indestructible life. We get to verse 20 here of chapter 7 all the way through chapter 8 verse 13, and essentially the author addressed the next the author here, which I think is Timothy, addressed the authorizing sources of the two priesthoods. He cited Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 31 through 34, and noted that the old covenant between God and Israel was dependent on the oath of man. Unfortunately, they did not continue in this covenant, but the new covenant promised through Jeremiah was different, because that oath was made entirely by God. There wasn't a second acceptance on this. So God swore to this new covenant, and it was eternally guaranteed because of that. And because of the divine oath, the new covenant is a better covenant, right? The covenant with Jesus is a better covenant. So the priesthood based on the old covenant was filled with priests who could not remain in office because they would die, right? But the new covenant priest always lives to intercede. The old covenant priesthood was filled with priests who were weak, but the new covenant priests were perfected forever through Jesus' obedient suffering. And the old covenant priests had to offer sacrifices every day, but the new covenant priests offered a sacrifice once for all time. Now, the old covenant priest sacrificed for both himself and his people, but the new covenant priest, being sinless, offered himself on behalf of the people. So that brings us to chapter 9. So here we are in chapter 9, the old covenant versus the new covenant. So he turns his attention here to a comparison of the ministries of the old and the new priesthoods. The regulations for ministry given through the old covenant were for an earthly sanctuary. Remember that temple, that earthly sanctuary. The sacrificial ministry of the old priesthood was unable to perfect the worshiper's conscience. The sacrificial ministry of Christ, though, is able to cleanse our consciences. Christ's ministry is superior here because he does not enter an earthly sanctuary, but into heaven itself. So unlike the high priest who entered annually into the most holy place, Christ entered into the most holy place once for all time. So unlike the old priesthood that offered the blood of animals, Christ offered his own blood here. And unlike the old priesthood that offered sacrifices continually without effect, or so it seemed, the blood of Christ obtained eternal redemption. And that brings us to chapter 10, which is the perfect sacrifice. So in these verses, in verses 1 through 18 here, he focuses on the superiority of the sacrifice of Christ. The old sacrifices were only a shadow of the blessed realities that came from the personal sacrifice of Christ, citing Psalm chapter 40, verses 6 through 8, there in verses 5 through 7 and forward. The author demonstrated that God was no longer interested in the whole burnt offering and sin offering of the old covenant. The old sacrifices had to be offered continually, as we said, and they did not accomplish anything really beyond ritual purification because they could not take away sins. Jesus, however, offered one sacrifice for our sins forever by offering himself. Now, afterward, he sat down on the throne of God. By his blood atonement, he has perfected forever, as it said, those who were sanctified. Now, we get to verses 19 through 39, and the author's exhortation to faithfulness contains commands, a warning, an encouraging reminder, a promise, and an expression of confidence. And due to the boldness, as it said, that believers have to enter the divine presence through the perfect sacrifice of Christ, the author commands his readers to do three things. 1, draw near to God with assurance. 2, hold on to their confession without wavering. And 3, watch out for one another and not forsake the gathering of the church. So the warning here at the very end is a reminder that there is no effective sacrifice for sin apart from that provided by Christ. So if Christians turn their backs on Jesus, they have absolutely no hope, only the expectation of terror for eternity. So, keeping all that in mind, I hope that helped you with your studies today. If it has, click the like button, subscribe button. Of course, click the little jingle bell so you get notified the next time I upload a video. And if you're rumbling with me on Rumble, hit that little jingle bell. And I will see you, hit the boxing glove actually for Rumble. And I will see you again tomorrow for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. I'll see you then.